Hey guys, Mark here with Hockey Culture Training and Systems. Today I'm jumping into part 3 of the 6-part miniseries I do on hockey's Big 6. Today, we're covering the United States of America. The Eagles have gone on to win World Championships in 1933, a World Cup in 1996, and a gold medal at the 1980 Olympics. Now, while the US has always been considered Canada's little brother in the game of hockey, it still has an extremely popular and growing following. And recently, the states have achieved more in the last 20 to 30 years than they have throughout their entire lifetime playing the game. But with that said, there is a special history that most don't realize. A culture and identity here within the states that have helped shape legends like Palmer Winthrop and Bill Christian, Bill and Bob Cleary, Jim Craig, Mike Eruzione, Mark Pavelich, Bob Sutter and Ryan Sutter, Mark Johnson, Mike Richter, John LeClaire, Keith Tkachuk, Jeremy Roenick, Brett Hull, Chris Chelios, Mike Modano, Ryan Miller, and many, many others. Now, to understand American hockey, it's important to understand Canadian hockey. That's where the game pretty much comes from. Then, in the late 1800s, hockey found its way across the border in places like Maine and Minnesota. However, it wasn't until 1914 that we would experience our first professional hockey team, when the Pacific Coast Hockey Association joined forces with the National Hockey Association, two of Canada's largest hockey leagues, and decided to expand its teams into the States. It started with the Portland Rosebuds, and the following year came the Seattle Metros. Both teams found success early on. I think it was the Portland Rosebuds who made it to the Stanley Cup first but would lose in their second year, and the Seattle Metros also in their second year making it to the Stanley Cup Finals, but this time winning it. They became the first American team to win the Stanley Cup. Yep, that's right. The Cup is that old. Now, it's important to understand that even with such success in America, very few Americans actually played for these teams. In the early days, they just weren't good enough, and as years went on, there became a little bit more of a thing where, like, you were an American, you could never be as good as a Canadian player. It would take generations and generations for that to actually change. Now, unfortunately, those two leagues and many others failed. But from the ashes, the National Hockey League was formed. The NHL, as we know today, was created in 1917 and evolved from the NHA. They slowly became the #1 league in the world, starting with the Boston Bruins in the American franchise, and later on the New York Americans, which was a team that inspired the New York Rangers, who won the Stanley Cup in 1927 to 1928. Now, with the popularity of hockey growing in the U.S. came the start of the national hockey team. Let it be known that most of the early era was Canada as #1, the U.S. as #2, and the rest of the world was basically fighting for #3. That wasn't until 1933 when the U.S. handed off its responsibility to the Boston Olympic Hockey Club to hold the tryouts and manage the players. The team was nicknamed the Massachusetts Rangers, and this would go on to become one of the 3 major miracles performed by the USA hockey team after they finally beat Canada 2-1 and ended their reign of gold medals. The team was coached by Walter Brown, who would later on own the Boston Bruins and the Boston Celtics, and they were led by goalie Gary Cosby, who would later go on to open the famous New York City hockey store in Madison Square Garden. The second miracle was in 1960 when a group of college kids would go on to win the Olympics and shocking the world. Sounds kind of familiar, right? The team was coached by John Riley, the typical hockey coach in America. He played for Dartmouth and coached at Army. He would go on to win multiple awards as both coach and pioneer in the game. Now, with a roster full of college players and college coaches, the team went to the 1960 Olympics and beat everyone. They went undefeated and won their first gold medal. Now, the third is far from forgotten and occurred in 1980. I'm sure all of you understand what I'm talking about. It's a team that almost didn't happen, but this tournament inspired a whole nation to believe that miracles can happen. And remember, this team almost didn't happen. I mean, the US was pretty much afraid of sending a team to its own Olympics that it was hosting and being embarrassed on the home ice. It all starts though with Herb Brooks, who believed in the team. As the story goes, Herb Brooks was almost part of the 1960 Olympic team. In the week before the games, Brooks was cut, and the team went on to win the gold medal without him. He later goes on record saying that John Riley made the obvious decision. I mean, they did win the gold, but nevertheless, you gotta imagine it left a little bit of fire within Brooks, who would go on to coach one of the best college hockey teams at Minnesota University. There he was building something special, a unique system unseen in the game at the time. He wanted to combine the typical Canadian-inspired US style, which was tough and simple, and blend it with the Soviet style, which was known for free-flowing and creativity, a sense of total hockey where offense plays defense and defense plays offense. Today that's pretty much how every team plays, but back then it was unique. Now Brooks would go on to have full control of the team, and he would select the right players to fit that specific system. The rest? It's a miracle. Now, this third miracle is far different from the other two, and it pretty much goes on to say that this is the U.S. hockey's most prestigious moment in their history. Remember, it's the height of the Cold War, so there's a little bit of politics involved. They go on to beat the Soviet Union. It's pretty much a punch in the face of communism. I think that's how a lot of people felt back then. It goes on to touch a generation and generations to come. And it teaches a lot of U.S. athletes in general and hockey players, youth hockey players, that anything's possible. Now, unfortunately, at least for the U.S., that success would go stagnant for a while, at least until 1996. The 1996 is when the NHL decided to host its first ever World Cup, trying to capitalize on the international tournaments. This is the best on best hockey, one of the first that we'll see of its time. And even though this team had many great players like Brian Leetch, Mike Richter, Keith Tkachuk, it still was pretty much of a shock to have beaten Canada and many other great teams in this tournament. I mean, you're looking at Canada, who has Wayne Gretzky, Mark Messier, Marty Brodeur, just to name a few of the legendary Hall of Famers on that team. So this is USA Hockey showing that when you put our best players on the ice, anything's possible. We are among the best of the best, especially when push comes to shove. And it was around this time in 1996 when the U.S. decided to put together the NTDP, or the National Team Developmental Program, to help identify elite talent and develop the next great generation of hockey players. It is one of the best investments U.S. hockey has ever had. With the NTDP at the forefront, U.S. hockey has now become truly competitive at all ages of international hockey. Now, I want to finish the U.S. off by talking about the 2010 Olympics, where they surpassed everyone's expectations of not medaling, having won the silver medal in the gold medal game of overtime against Canada. The reason why I want to talk about this is Brian Burke here, who built the team in a classic U.S. fashion. He didn't build the best team, with the most talented names, but he built the right team according to his specific system. I recall an interview with him where he talks about building the team properly through goalie out approach, right? So it's more like a defensive type of approach. But he wanted to build the team to be very diverse. He wanted to have a top six and a bottom six, which means top six are considered artists. These are your most talented players on the ice. And the bottom six are your blue-collar workers who are will be there for your heavy hitting and your defensive needs and so forth. And he did the same thing with his defense, having a top four and a bottom two. This is the type of blueprint and designing of a team that made me really proud of being a U.S. hockey player and a U.S. hockey fan. Now, as an American, I'll admit it, U.S. hockey doesn't have exactly the most prestigious of histories to talk about, especially of all the histories I'll be talking about within this series. They are often the underdogs, and that's why they have quite the number of miracles to talk about. But there's still much to be excited for in the future of Hockey USA. Like 1, the NHL continues to expand to different parts of our country, and the league is doing very well. 2, the number of American-born players are growing rapidly within the league and across the country, especially those considered elite. So, I leave you with this, USA Hockey in a nutshell. It's a country inspired to play the game like their northern neighbors, A game that we slowly turned into our own by blending a bit of the best tactics and best strategies used by all of our enemies. And there, we created something unique for us. That's USA Hockey. Thank you for everyone who listened to part 3 of the Big 6 mini-series. If you liked the video and you want to know when the final 3 episodes will be released, then subscribe to the channel and give it a like. Thank you everyone. Cheers.